If you have watched my 3-part series, linking multiple displays to the M1 Pro and M1 Max, stress testing the system, and seeing how the Creative Photo app are responding when we have multiple display link up, you will find out that these computers are highly capable machines. However, one of my followers have asked me the question, what happens if I run my computer in clamshell mode and link up to 2 4K displays? How would the performance be? And that really raises a good question, so I am making one more video to show you just that. Let's find out together. This is Artist Right. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. This will be another multiple display test, but the scenario will be slightly different. The laptop will be kept in clamshell mode, and I will test this linking up to 2 external 4K displays in a few different scenarios. For the test, I'll be showing the result for Lightroom Classic and Capture One. The reason why I'm not really showing the result for Final Cut Pro is that when we have the M1 Max link up to 4 external 4K displays and setting all the resolutions for those displays to the highest scale, it does really well. There's really no point showing you that test because Final Cut Pro has been fully optimized for this system. But Lightroom Classic and Capture One, that will give you a slightly different story. The 2 test system that I have, one of them will be the base 14-inch MacBook Pro. I really love that machine to do testing because it really shows you how capable that 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU is, and you're gonna find out that it's still really capable with this kind of setup. The next setup that I have is the M1 Max, 10 CPU, 32 GPU, and 32 gigabytes of memory. For macOS scaling, I'll be showing you 2 types of resolution. One of them will be running at 4K native, and the other one will be running at the highest scale resolution, 3360 by 1890. The difference between these two is that on the 4K native, we're pushing out around 8.3 megapixels to each of these displays. However, when we run this at the full scale resolution, your computer is now processing 3 times as much data for each of these displays, 60 times per second. These are 60 Hz display, and it's now pushing 25.4 megapixels out to each one of these 4K monitors. And we're gonna find out how they perform. Quickly about these displays, this is BenQ PD3220U. This is part of their Pro Designer series, and that is BenQ SW271C. That is their flagship SW line hardware calibrated display, 99% Adobe RGB for photographers. The way how these displays are linked to the laptop is this is linked via a Thunderbolt cable, and that one is linked via a USB Type-C cable, and they're both going to the ports directly on the machine. They're not being daisy-chained or anything like that at all. For this and the testing, I'll be running Safari in the background with 6 tabs open. There's no video playing, but I do have YouTube site open. I will run Lightroom Classic. We'll be testing a 192 megapixel panorama to see how the brush responds when we run it in different resolution, different mode on 2 external display and a laptop in clamshell. We're also going to be testing a 36 megapixel RAW file. And for Capture One, the story is going to be somewhat similar, 36 megapixel RAW file and also 120 megapixel panorama to see how the program responds when we do dual screen editing in these creative apps. And for this test, I will leave all these apps running in the background, and we are going to start to see systems swapping to the SSD, because even when I'm testing both of these systems with 32 gigabytes, when we're really pushing it hard, it still needs to do swap. But this is also another reason why if you're a Creative Pro, 16 gigabytes of RAM is definitely going to be a big limitation factor in just the overall user experience, and is going to swap to the SSD much more. So if you're a pro, you run multiple apps, you multitask, it's a great idea to upgrade to 32 gigabytes of memory, because this memory, because it is unified, it means that it is shared between the CPU and GPU. No matter how fast it is, you still want to have more memory, because if your app needs that memory, well, having more memory is going to be better than not having it enough on your system. This is the test template that I will use. For the 14-inch base, I will test it in 2 different modes. One of them will be 4K native dual screen edit. The other one will be at scale resolution dual screen edit. And for the M1 Max with the 32 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, I'll be showing you editing in dual screen setup similar to this at scale resolution to see how they perform. So let's jump right into the test. This first test is with the base 14-inch MacBook Pro, 8 CPU, 14 GPU, 32 gigabytes of memory, running in clamshell mode, link up to 2 external 4K displays, running at 4K native. In the background of this machine, I have Lightroom Classic running. There is system preferences showing the display resolution, Safari with 6 tab open, no videos playing, Capture One that has my pictures already preloaded so we can jump right into it, and let's look at Lightroom Classic. Before we do that, let's take a quick peek at the memory. We have already started swapping on the system and the memory pressure is sitting at around 50%. As I start to do more heavy editing, it will jump up and it will constantly bounce between 50 to maybe about 60 or 70 or so, depending on what I am doing, but so far so good. And this is another reason why if you're a Creative Pro and you're running multiple apps, you're working with large files, go for the 32 gigabyte at the very minimum. It's going to help out a lot. So let's start out with the panorama file. This is the 192 megapixel. We'll jump into develop module and you will see that as I'm starting to move these sliders up and down, the changes are being reflected on both of these displays almost instantaneously. This is what we are expecting to see. This is something that we want to have our machine perform like because this is awesome. Let's now do a sky selection. And it is taking a quick moment there to do sky selection. We'll do a brush and we'll zoom in on this picture starting at the corner. And let's see how the brush does. This is with auto mask on. So it's constantly detecting edge as I'm moving my brush around. It's extremely smooth. There are no slowdowns whatsoever that I can observe. This is really just fantastic. So yeah, the user experience on this file is extremely smooth. Let's now look at a 36 megapixel Aurora Borealis photo that I use in my other tests, and let's start with the edit. So the one thing that I noticed is that once I load in a large file, you can see that there is some slight lag between the internal or between the first and secondary display, but it's really not too big of a difference and the performance is still considered pretty good. Let's do another sky selection. And this one's pretty fast because the file is smaller. Let's use the brush on the Aurora. Auto mask is still enabled and the brush experience is extremely smooth. No lag, no slowdown whatsoever. So if you want to run even just the base 14-inch one in this configuration, you'll be perfectly fine. Let's look at Capture One, starting with the 36 megapixel RAW of the Aurora Borealis. You can see that as I'm dialing these sliders up and down, the change is reflecting on the external display fairly quickly. It does take a quick moment to do the final rendition, but overall, I think this is really good. Let's add a gradient in the sky and see how fast that change reflects. So as I'm pulling this up and down, this is happening pretty much instantaneously. This is something really great to see. Let's now have a look at the 120 megapixel panorama. I'll start to edit, pulling up the sliders up and down. You can still see that the program is responding to this fairly quickly and the render is fairly fast. And this is, again, really great to see. Let's add a gradient in the sky one more time. And as I'm changing this, the rendition is showing up really quickly on the external display. The thumbnail does take a little bit longer for it to update. However, this is really not bad at all. It's really a usable experience when you're running this base model at 4K native. This is the second test, same base 14-inch MacBook Pro, same displays. However, they are now running at scale resolution 3360 by 1890. So the laptop GPU is now pushing 25.4 megapixels to each of these displays, 3 times as much per displays at 60 times per second. Let's start with Lightroom Classic. 192 megapixel panorama. There is a slight stutter in these sliders, however, the changes are happening fairly quickly. And when we're really pushing the computer this hard, I would say this is definitely acceptable. Let's do a sky selection. And we'll zoom in and do a brush removal to see how smooth that is. Auto mask is still on. So far, the brush is responding pretty well. However, there is a slight lag when I'm moving the brush around that it takes just a quick moment. And as I press the space bar to move the photo, there is a slight stutter, but this really makes sense. I mean, we're pushing 3 times as much data as we were before on both of these displays. Considering that this is a setup and the computer can still catch up with it fairly well, that I haven't received a spinning beach ball yet, this is considered good. Let's have a look at the 36 megapixel Aurora Borealis photo. This is where the sliders start to stutter a little bit more. As I'm moving, it's not really responding quite as fast. And that is because we already load a lot of the memory on the machine with the panorama file. And you can see that there is a definite delay when I'm adjusting, for example, the brightness between the first and second display. It does take a moment for it to update on the external display. Do a sky selection. And we'll do a subtraction again with auto mask using a brush. So far, yes, there is a lag on the brush just slightly. For instance, I already draw that brush, release my hand from the cursor, then the program really started to respond. So this is really pushing the system really hard, but we start to see a slight delay when we're running at the scale resolution, and this is something to be expected. Let's now look at Capture One, starting with the Aurora Borealis photo. 36 megapixel raw file. We can see that when it's running at scale resolution, it does take a significant longer time to update the secondary display. I'll make an exposure adjustment, and it did took a moment there to push the changes out and render it out on the second display. Let's do a gradient. Gradient's reflecting on the thumbnail first, and it is taking more than a few seconds to render out on the external display. Once it has, it renders the follow-up fairly quickly, but there is some lag and delay happening. What happened if we throw in a 120 megapixel panorama? It is taking a moment for it to initially render. We'll start making these changes. So far I was able to catch up with this file fairly well. Put in a gradient in the sky. And this is a little bit more instantaneous than the other shot. And a lot of this could be as a simple fact that, yes, this is a larger panorama file, but the information that the computer needs to process to render this out, it's mostly just sky. So there's not a lot of details like the stars, like the aurora, like the different tones. And that may be the reason why it's performing slightly better on the panorama. But if we take a look at this, when we're using the base 14-inch computer with these two displays running at scale resolution, it's still really respectable. This is the third and final test. 16-inch M1 Max 10 CPU, 32 GPU, link up to 2 external 4K displays running in clamshell mode and at scale resolution 3360 by 1890. So the computer GPU is pushing out 25.4 megapixels to each of these displays 60 times per second. Both of these are linked up via a Thunderbolt, and the other one is via a USB Type-C directly to the computer. And in the background, I have Lightroom Classic, Safari with 6 tab open, and Capture One ready to go. we will see from the memory usage that I have already started to go through the swap on the system, but not quite as much yet because I haven't processed the file through. However, the moment I start to go in and run processing, we will see the swap going higher. Let's start out with Lightroom Classic, 192 megapixel panorama. And changes are being reflected on the secondary display fairly quickly. There are some slight lag and glitches, but you will see that it's updating pretty quick. So this is Lightroom Classic unoptimized for these multiple GPUs, these new M1 Pro and M1 Max yet. And considering it's able to catch up, it's pretty good. The experience is definitely smoother than when we were using the base M1 Pro. Sky selection still takes about the same amount of time. Let's try subtraction with the brush. And this is with auto mask going on. So far it's able to catch up, but the same thing that's been showing up on the base 14-inch where I start to drag the brush and the program takes a moment to catch up, this is still relevant here. We start to see some glitching when I am trying to move. For instance, I'll do this and I'll try to move. There is a slight glitch, there is a slight lag. So not big of a difference when you really consider the base 14-inch one to the top M1 Max. And again, this really comes down to the optimization. Let's have a look at the Aurora. And we are looking at the swap. You will see that it has gone through quite a bit of swap already. And our memory pressure is sitting at 55%, although it has been bouncing up and down between 55 and 70. This is a 36 megapixel file. And if I start to do these rapidly, you will notice that these sliders, again, I'm trying to pull that. It's not really adjusting quite as fast as I want to. There are some slowdown and glitches, and it does take a moment longer for it to render on the secondary display. Let's do sky selection. And if we take a look at this machine and look at the delta in pricing compared to the base processor to the M1 Max, they're looking at around $700 based on the spec that I am testing right now. Not too big of a difference with regards to the way how Lightroom Classic is performing. We'll do a subtraction with the brush, auto mask on. I'll focus on the Aurora area, and there is some slight lag. For instance, I just draw that, let go of the cursor, and it's still trying to draw. So yeah, there is some lag still, but the user experience on the M1 Max 32 GPU is a slight touch smoother, but there is still some slowdown and lag that we're seeing. Let's look at Capture One, 36 megapixel Aurora, and I'll start pushing the sliders. So far the program's able to catch up a little bit faster. However, there is some slight hesitation and delay as I'm adjusting, for instance, the brightness. You can see right now that it does take a few seconds for it to render on the second display. And let's do a gradient. It's taking a moment for it to render on the secondary display, and the moment it does, it's responding a little bit quicker. So not too bad. Let's look at 120 megapixel panorama. It's catching up with the program just fine. If I go in and brighten and darken, it seems to be responding pretty quickly. Let's do another gradient. So the one thing that we notice on this machine, the M1 Max, is that the rendition on the secondary display can take a moment long, similar to the base M1 Pro. However, it is a touch smoother based on what I'm seeing right now compared to the base model, but we're looking at a $700 difference. What do I think about this whole thing? I think that any machine that you choose, any of the SoC processor GPU combination that you use, if you're just using your computer for a pro workflow in a setup very similar to what I have right now with 2 external 4K displays linked up to the system in clamshell mode with some app running in the background, I think you're going to be okay. There may be some lag here and there, and to which at this point what you would probably do is go in and choose another scale resolution or run it at native, which if you don't really like small text on a 4K display, native can be really hard to see. So I would probably go in and choose maybe the equivalent to a 2K display scaling, and that will definitely speed up the way how these computers and these programs are running on the external display. Before I leave you, I want to quickly show you the memory swap on the system, that it is happening quite a bit, and the memory pressure that I am using right now is between 50 to around 75%. So for something like this, I would probably look into getting a machine with more memory, like 64 gigabytes. This way the memory pressure is lower, but what that really means is that if your memory pressure is in the 50 to like 70 or even higher, you probably need more memory in your system. And that's one way to just use memory pressure on these computers, either in the iStat menu that I'm using or through the activity monitor to determine how much memory you need on your computer. I hope that you find this test and this information helpful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new. And remember, in art we trust.